Hi everyone, this is Steph K here. This is my first little series I'm trying to make, partially hold myself accountable, and for me to be able to, kind of share my experiences or help others who want to become pro or compete in TFT. I'm not at that level yet, so that's a disclaimer. I'm not at the level yet. This is just my path to becoming there. And all the information I've been getting is kind of been spread all over. It's been taking me a while to get this sort of information. I think usually it might be easier for people to kind of just, if you like get really into it, you can be able to find it. But for a lot of people who just don't have a lot of time on their hands or just want to be able to kind of find a consolidated space to get the information, hopefully this sort of helps. But this also is to help, me as well, because of the fact that there's a lot of things that you have to do. And a lot of it is like studying and looking at stats and that kind of stuff, watching VODs and kind of reviewing it, a lot of things. And it's something I'm very new to, but that's required and needed to become at that level of, competing with the best of the best, right? And I mean, even if you just want to get better at the game, you don't want to compete, right? It's still the same methods still apply because it's just how you get better. So I figured to just start the series. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to consistently post this either weekly or try to post it weekly. I think daily is a little bit, I think, a really good stretch, but I think there's a lot to cover in general. But then there's a lot of information that runs out. So there's that. Disclaimer, my rank currently is Masters 300 LP. But the biggest thing to know is that, like, LP is not really a good reflection of your skill. And what's really important is how you develop as a player. I mean, we have challenger players who are kind of sitting in grandmasters, right? Pros, but like, are they actual grandmasters? No. So this is just kind of really important, and it's good to separate rank from, skill level, and LP from skill level. So today I'm going over kind of how to look over at stats. This is just what I've learned recently, and it's still not perfect. I've had one of the top pros kind of reached out and asked for them, like, what are tips, and one of them that they said is that you need to look at studying stats. And what's really important with stats is that kind of tells you the story that not everything tells you. So one of the biggest things I'm going to go over right now is kind of line selection, and line selection with the stats, and like knowing like what are good alternative items if you can't make BIS. So today I'll be looking over at one of my favorite comps, which is kind of a little bit easier, and I'll be going over a couple other comps as well. So that way it's not just filtering to one comp and then kind of just showcasing like what are things to do when you're building this. So then you have like information ready to go. So I'll be looking at Slayers today. So currently the comp that's being displayed is Slayers. And you can see here like the BIS stats or items are QSS, Kraken, and Giant Slayer. And then Bessa has, like Death Blade, Sterix, Hand of Justice. And also, this is the TFT Academy site, the Frodans and Digital sites. So kind of, I'll link in the description. I think it's really useful. I think it's really good access. There's a lot of really helpful sites that tell you like builds and really useful things. Kind of just going over that. And then we have Rift Herald, we have Sunfire Cape, Even Shroud, Protectors. And what's really important to know is like, why do we want these items? Why do we want these items? And sometimes it's the abilities and the champions themselves, but also sometimes it's just like what the items provide and what the statistics say. Like right now we see on Aatrox it says like BT, Sterix, and Titans. Is that actually the best? We'll figure it out and look at stats. So if we look at it, first I'll look at Belveth, right? So if we look at Belveth here, and filters, it is kind of early into the patch of 16.4. So it's kind of a little bit harder to sort of filter it. But I think we don't want to filter too hard because there's not enough games or sample size. But what's really important to look at, if we look at items, right, we can see that QSS is 4.14 and it's a minus 23 placement change. So that kind of information is really helpful and really useful. All right, and then we have also Kraken and then Giant Slayer, but we can see that the delta or the placement changes is between the 0.09 and 0.11. We can see that the numbers here that like in terms of average placement, like, oh, like this is kind of like the kind of similar numbers ish. But then if we look at like, this is a big placement change, why? So, I think another way to see is like how important is this item? Also we can see like down here, like Dark and Bow, it's a low sample size, but like it's a pretty big difference. But if we look at like QSS, so Quicksilver, and if we exclude it, we can see like, okay, like if it's not on Belveth, the placement changes. It's pretty big. Previously when you have QSS, it's a 0.14. If you remove it, it's kind of reflective of that difference. So now we know like, okay, that's pretty important. So let's filter more. What happens if we add Giant Slayer? Okay, Giant Slayer kind of goes up, but is Giant Slayer needed? It's like 0.17. It's not as important, right? Like I think like it's like roughly a 0.09. So how important is Giant Slayer? It's not super important. What about we include Kraken? Kraken 0.10, 0.23. So like is Kraken pretty important? It's kind of filtering like just which is just QSS, but like what are other items? We put back on Giant Slayer, it still goes up. So it's like it's just you need one or the other. You don't necessarily need both of them. And, if you do both, like you can see like, okay, it just jumps up to 0.03, so 0.07. So it's just a 0.03 difference. So it's not like the massive difference or change, right? Like I think you have to just kind of keep a note like, oh, okay, cool. We know like what's really needed. Like, what happens if we remove QSS now? We just lose. Like the placement is dramatic. So, even if we put Titans, like, okay, cool. Like it does jump up, but like, how often you really been Titans on her? Because the biggest thing about her is that she doesn't want to get CC immunity. She's an auto attacker, right? If we look at her ability, it says on takedown you gain attack speed, and while transformed she gains attack speed and max health and increased movement speed, and the attacks do true damage. So she kind of is more of a ramp champion. You want her to ramp, and Quicksilver gives her attack speed and CC immunity, so she's allowed to ramp for those first 18 seconds. Kind of a big deal. Slayers is kind of like a tempo comp, right? You kind of want to just overrun them as quick as possible. If you kind of get too late into the fight, you kind of just fall over. So kind of important to look at those stats, right? Notes, like I think you can always say like, okay, if we have one or the other item, right? Like there's not that big of a difference. So you can just have one or the other. And the third item could be Dark and Bow, could be Vanquish Emblem. You can even see like the placement changes here. Like you can see like, oh, this is a 0.20 minus 0.24. So like, hey, Dark and Bow is really good. If it's offered to you, like, why not take it, right? But that's like another topic. If you have like a Vanquisher Emblem or that kind of stuff, like what are other alternative items? And what's key note to look at is frequencies. So like sample size, like how often are we seeing this? It is day 2 of the patch, so 16.4. So this is subject to change whenever you look at stats. This can change later on in the patch because people have more time to optimize it, and just little things like that. So kind of just a brief note, but it's really good to kind of look at stats. And sometimes you can maybe between patches nothing really changed between the patches, so then you can kind of just even use like the previous patch up here. So this is really important to note, like when you're looking at this, like this is really important to note. Like these placement changes kind of skew everything. So there's like, that's an example of Belveth. We can use like another champion as an example. So I think we can use like Ambessa, right? I think Ambessa is kind of one of the bigger topics. Before originally, the items that she wanted was kind of like, people were saying you want QSS and Hodge and then Sterix, but like you can see like the placement isn't so bad. But recently, like the biz has changed. If we look at back at TFT Academy, it's kind of, you just put like Deathblade like damage on her, but like you can see like then she kind of just jumps up, right? The sample sizes are pretty low, but I think what's still important to note, like, okay, like make your own observations, like what are actually good items. So we can kind of just look at like, we put in like, in this case, because Ambessa's used in multiple comps, I think we can kind of just filter it down a little bit to like 2 Vanquisher, and then we kind of do like Void, or have Void in there, I guess Slayer, right? Have like a Slayer, although kind of the filtering again, it's not perfect, right? You gotta kind of just need to figure out how it looks. I think we could probably just open up the 2 or 3 Vanquisher. So kind of again looking at here, right? Like Edge of Night is pretty good. I mean, point minus 25 is pretty good, right? Hand of Justice, like 0.18. I think that's also pretty good. Sterix is like, I think it's in the yellow, so you're kind of like, like, you know, like we see like how like QSS 0.09, like these two are kind of like the same. So what does that say, right? We can even kind of scroll down further. You can see here, Strikers is minus 47. Low sample size, but we can even go back to like 16.3 B patch, and we can kind of see like Strikers is still pretty good, you know, and Diamond Plus, you know, Hodge is pretty good. QSS at the time, people were building it a lot, but like, you know, we can see like Edge of Night was really good, you know, Strikers was really good, Deathblade was really good. So with that, you know, we can kind of start to make the assumptions like what are actually better items than what is listed, or like experiments like what are good alternative items. So I think we can say like Hand of Justice on Mbessa. Okay, cool. What if I can't make a QSS, you know, or like what's other items that can make up for it? I think Strikers fail is extremely good based off of the average placement. Yes, again, like low sample size, but I think this is kind of like an outlier, right? Then there's more of the story to the stats as well. Very important to note. So I think let's just throw in Strikers Flail, right? And then now what's the really good item that works with it? You have other items where like, okay, maybe we just raw damage, you know, maybe Edge of Night's still really good, you know, stuff like that. But I think here generally we kind of want something to have like CC immunity, cleansing. I mean, we have to consider how Mbessa works as a unit, right? She kind of slams into the units and kind of can end up in the back line and end up pulling aggro. So I kind of personally think that Edge of Night's really good. So based off of that, I think we just go off of Edge of Night and we can kind of see like, oh, the average place is now 3.68. That's pretty good, right? And then, I mean, we kind of can, even if we just remove, we just put an Edge of Night back instead. All right, 4.10. You know, what happens if we put like Deathblade? It goes up the point, you know. If we assume that the core items are instead a Hodge, you know, Hand of Justice, Edge of Night / GA, however you want to call it, we can kind of go off the assumption like what are outliers here. Bloodthirster is an extremely horrible item on her. We can see this, like this is extremely high placement. We kind of put on her, the average placement kind of jumps up, right? We can see Sterix. How does Sterix work? Kind of Sterix jumps up again. Maybe Sterix isn't actually that great, you know. These items kind of tell you a lot more. You know, QSS can still be considered good. I personally just don't think it's that great, but you know, feel free to test, and that's what the stats kind of tell you too, right? Like, is it actually good or not? You know, you kind of use the stats and use as your own example, and then you know we can kind of assume. I think, you know, based off the assumptions, I think we're kind of slamming like, okay, what about Giant Slayer? Giant Slayer is still pretty good. Average solution 3.91, right? Deathblade, you know, same results. It's even lower. You know, what about Strikers? Again, like kind of gets even lower and lower, right? So I think placement change is kind of really important despite the small sample size. You know, you can also increase it if you want to include Emerald and kind of see like how big is the placement jump. You know, Giant Slayer, you know, Strikers is still pretty good up there. Dark and Scythe is pretty good now all of a sudden. You know, Giant Slayer is really good. So it kind of stats from here kind of tell the story again, right? And kind of give you what's actually better. Or if you don't have like, oh, I can't get BIS items, right? Like, you know, again, like the TFT Academy site says we want Sterix, Hodge, Deathblade. But if we can't get Deathblade, you know, or if we can't get Sterix, what's a good alternative, right? Like instead we just put in Sterix. Then we can just look at alternatives, right? And we can see like Strikers is still really good. You know, Deathblade's obviously really good. So if you can't make a Deathblade, but you can make a Strikers, just make Strikers and put it on her, you know. Or we have 3 completed Belviv items and we have a Darken artifact given to us. Hey, Scythe is really good, right? So things to kind of keep in note, and it's really important to keep stats at. And then from there, how we can kind of keep that in our heads is kind of just putting it in a place. And so I have a little document here. It's a little document that was provided to me by one of my really close friends, Miss Fortune, and she's really good at making these documents and Excel sheets, and it's kind of been really helpful. If you can make something similar to this, or find like a copy of your own, I think it's really important. So I think one of the things that I should, you know, trying to do that was recommended to me is like when you look at stats, put it somewhere so you have easy access to it, but also you have reference to. And you can see here, like, there's a bunch of comps that I would ideally want to play, and then kind of build it and have an ideal opener spot. So then when I'm going into my games and playing, I know, hey, this is the spot for me to play Slayers, or this is a spot for me to play Demacia, stuff like that. So, here I'll just put Slayers, Belveth / Aatrox / Ambessa, right? And we can kind of go over what is the playstyle. It's a fast 8 comp. What are the synergies? I think it's really important to think about the synergies in the comp. So we have like Vanquisher, Slayer, Jug, because you're playing generally, if you're looking at the comp, what are listed stuff, you have like Vanquisher, Slayer, Juggernaut, Bruiser, Noxus. We can kind of just say like Bruiser, because you kind of want, since it's a melee comp, you kind of want that extra, if you can slot in that extra HP, that's great. If you want to talk about the regions, it's like Noxus, Void, Flex. If you can't really play, you ideally want to be playing 2 Void, right? Because it kind of gives Belveth a free extra item with the Void mod. Obviously, that's Void mechs. And then what are good opening units? We can talk about the opening units. So, like, what are good opening units? We can kind of look here and look at the, the tier list maker, or even like the builder. We can see here, like, what are good opening units. I think if we're doing a Slayer, Briar, Kiana, these are good openers generally, right? Slayer's opener. You can even use like Yasuo. Rek'Sai is a good opener because you get Void in early, Cho. Kind of get your Rift Herald on 3/5. You don't need to have Rift Herald, but I think it's kind of nice to have Rift Herald. So this is kind of just really important, So if we're kind of looking back, what are good opening units? So I kind of say like Slayer's opener, Kiana, Briar, Yasuo. You can also do like Void opener, specifically Rek'Sai +1 Void, right? And then we can talk about like opening components. What are ideally opening components you want? Well, if we go back to look at the stats, we kind of saw that like Belveth really wants QSS. And the other thing important to note is who is the main carry in the comp. I think primarily, since we're looking at the site, it says like, hey, Belveth is kind of the main focus of the comp, so we should focus on Belveth. But at the same time, because we know that the main number 1 prior item that we need for Belveth is QSS, we can kind of just say like, ideally, Cloak, Glove, +1, not Rod, right? Because you want a Cloak Glove to make the QSS, but you can also be, if you have like a tier and you have an open glove, you can kind of just make the Hodge. If you don't have a cloak at all, but you have a glove tier and you have like another item like a sword, you can kind of just make items that you want to make. Like, you don't have to commit to the items as long as you get the QSS. I think is really important. And then carousel items, usually it's probably like glove / cloak, sword, bow. And so writing this down, this is kind of helping solidify what do I need to prio. Even carousel priority, we can kind of see here like what is it that we want. It literally says cloak, glove, sword, bow. And I kind of I didn't even think about it, right? I didn't even look at the site. I kind of just knew off the top of my head. And that's really important, because if you know right off the top of your head, you're wasting less time on that specific things of like, oh, I'm unfamiliar with the comp, right? If you write it down ahead of time, if you studying, I'm like, oh, if I looked back at the site before I went in the game, I know what I need. Therefore, that when I'm in game, I'm wasting time like, I don't know what to get. And then if someone steals your item, you're kind of just like, oh, I'm kind of stuck. Like, what do I do? Right? Really important. So kind of going into that, and then what are augments? I think if we consider what are augments, like there's a list of augments here. Like there's combat, there's items, XP to kind of get to level 8 faster, more items. Boxing lessons is really good for health. Sweet treats because it gives you an artifact and infinity protection. So I think we can kind of look at this. What is the augment priority? It says econ items in combat. I would generally agree with that. I think what's really important but if we're looking at like what is Slayers as a comp, that's a lot of items. That's 3 items, 6 items, 9, 12 items. Again, that's a lot of items. So I think what's really important based off of that is that we probably want to have a lot of items. So I think generally what's really important is maybe have one econ augment, one max, ideally max, and then items, right? I think if you're talking like your 2-1 opener, 2-1 opener should be econ ideally, right? So then that way you can focus on your 3-2 and your 4-2 being items, right? Really good. I mean, slamming is probably one of the better ones because you get one free component and you're getting free 2 XP every time. And as a Slayer's comp, you're ideally slamming items to keep tempo, to be healthy, because the items are very flexible, you know. And then so VIP DPS items, right? So let's talk about VIP DPS items. We talked about it. You know, we can say Belveth, QSS, must have, +1, one bow sword item, Kraken / GS, right? We kind of looked at that, right? Belveth is a QSS must have. Okay, what about, you know, Mbessa? Kind of saw that Hodge is really good, so we can say Hodge, and you know, in this case, I'll say plus EON, +1, DV, GS, strikers. You know, those are really good items that we know that we want. We definitely must have QSS over Belveth, and Belveth is our main priority. And I do know that we do have Aatrox in the comp, but I think we can kind of just ignore Aatrox-ish for the time being, because you can always move Aatrox items to Mbessa items to Aatrox too. Aatrox is still a really strong item unit, and he does have a slightly different items I'm pretty sure that you kind of want, but like the main priority is like you're generally going to hit Mbessa 2 and Belveth 2 before Aatrox 2, so it's better to focus on what you know you can hit, and then if you hit Aatrox later, you know, we will dive a little bit deeper into what are good Aatrox items. Usually if you hit Aatrox 2, you should end up generally top 4ing. VIP tank items. So we kind of can see here like Rift kind of wants like Even Shroud, Protectors, Sunfire. You know, this makes sense, right? Because these are utility items. Like he's supposed to help tank a little bit and live, so your carries can do the work. But this, because we're not really a stall comp, he doesn't need like prime tank items, right? He's kind of becomes like some utility, right? I think if you look at a different comp like Kaisa, his biz changes, right? And that's mainly because of the fact that instead our utility, like he is the primary tank, and we need him to live as long as possible so Kaisa can do a lot of damage because she's scaling, right? This is kind of really important to look at in terms of stats, and so if we're looking at stats, that's kind of really important. So we can kind of go back to here, and I'll use tactics tools as an example. So we kind of put in Belveth, you know, and Rift Herald. You know, how does it look if we have Even Shroud? You know, what the win rate is 4.16. What happens if we add Even Shroud on Rift Herald? Okay, all of a sudden the placement is pretty big, 3.88. What happens if we exclude Even Shroud? That placement's kind of huge, right? So I think that's kind of a VIP item. What about Sunfire? You know, we look at Sunfire. How important is Sunfire? Sunfire is also pretty huge, so that's kind of like a big deal, right? We kind of need these two items. So, you know, if we put in, you know, check Sunfire. You know how Sunfire is big. Sunfire goes up by point, you know, 0.02. Doesn't have to be necessarily on Rift. You just kind of want it, and then when, you know, we throw in Even Shroud, and then the placement kind of goes up. So that's pretty crazy. Kind of important to know. I'm curious to see, you know, how, you know, because Aatrox has Sunder built into his kit, how important is Sunder still? Once we include Aatrox, the placement goes up. But if we include Even Shroud, does it still kind of go up? Okay, it goes up. It's pretty drastic, you know. I think that's kind of important to know. And then we kind of put back Even Shroud, you know, put on Rift. The placement is still pretty big, so I think it's really important to note that you kind of still want Even Shroud. So I would say the VIP items for this comp is Even Shroud, Sunfire, +1. You know, what is the +1? I mean, it can be any tank item. You don't want to be really greedy. You know, we can kind of see like, okay, what happens if we have Even Shroud on Rift Herald plus Sunfire on Rift Herald, right? Okay, so we can see the items here, like 3 item count. Yeah, it's a little bit different. Kind of want to look at tank items, but like, you know, we can see here like, oh, okay, like Rift Herald is Crown Guard isn't the best, still good. Declaw is pretty not bad, right? Pure tank item, pretty good. Stone Plate's really bad right now. I would not recommend it. Steadfast is really good as a true tank item. Bramble's really good. I think Declaw or Bramble, you need to, it depends on the state of the game or like what do you want. Visage is really high. Protectors is kind of decent. So kind of if you look at between these two, you're like, oh, okay, cool. I know between the placement, the delta placement changes, right? We can kind of look at here like, oh, like 0.14, 0.23. If I'm going to prioritize the one item, what about win rate? Okay, well, if I'm going to place, if you're wanting to win out, you can probably argue that like Protectors is better. But if we're looking at general delta, right? Like what is your higher average placement? This is just probably you're good to go. So I think it's kind of like a really good key point. So kind of going back, kind of just said like +1. So probably Visage Protectors. Oh. Visage Protectors. So, and if there's any extra notes that I want, I could say like slam items throughout the game to save HP. Comp is expensive. 36 to 48 gold to 2-star. Belvev, Rift Herald, Mbessa, Swain. Important to note that Sunder is really needed and need a lot of items, so we must have at least one item econ. Item augments are considered combat in this comp. So, and then we can kind of go like, who is the primary carry? Belvev. We kind of know based off of the site and kind of just based off the stats as well. And a secondary carry in Mbessa/Aatrox. Primary tank, Rift, ideally. And then the max cap, so we're talking about max cap. What is like when we hit level 9, who are we flexing in, throwing in? So we kind of look at the board right now. Normally it has like Shyvana, Fiddle. These are your max caps. But if we're talking like how the board originally looks, I think it was originally like Belvev, Mbessa, Rift, Aatrox, Scion. Where's my boy Swain? I can't find Swain. So normally the comp kind of looks more like this, right? We have a lot of units. So you can say like, what are the flex thing? The VIP units would be generally Shyvana over Cho'Gath, and then Fiddle over Rek'Sai. And then you can just throw in Senna at the end, or Senna or Taric at the end, because that's your max cap board. So I can say max cap would be Fiddle over Rek'Sai, Shyvana over Cho'Gath, and then Senna on 9. That's my max cap. And then I have a team planner. What is the final board of items? So, in this case, I will just do like the level 9 cap board of what I thought, right, from my findings. Kind of just use my findings. So kind of just throw items on there as an example. So like QSS, we think, I can just leave like a +1, right, because it doesn't have to be anything. I mean, we can kind of see back if we clear the filters again and kind of go back to this, what are Belvev items, right? We can do QSS. You can do Giant Slayer, and we can kind of see like what's also good items, like Deathblade's not bad, so Darkened Bow. So I kind of just gonna leave it up as it's a +1, and then it kind of makes things easier for us. Okay, what about Mbessa? Mbessa kind of wants, Hodge, and then we saw that EON was really good on her, so let's put Edge of Night, and then Rift, and then Sunfire. So there's our board, right? We can say that's our board. And what about augments? And then we can talk about augments. We can talk like Big Grab Bag, really good. Swordsmith, probably really good. Even Sword Overflow. I think if you think about Sword Overflow, that's pretty good. 4 BF swords, you can get attack speed, just double Death Blade, either Belveth or one Death Blade for Belveth, one Death Blade for Mbessa, you're really good to go. What about, slamming? Really good econ augments. Patient study was listed. Um, and then, maybe what's a good combat? You can always throw in a combat. You can do indiscriminate killer. And I can do indiscriminate killer and just call it a day, right? So like these are like we're fleshing it out, and that's just really important. And then, copy the link, and then just do Belveth Slayers. And then, that's essentially it, right? Like now, if you look back, I think for my testing, it's been pretty improved. So we kind of look back, we kind of just went over stats and then kind of line composition and kind of when you're using these stats, where are you effectively going to use and put them in. So we kind of made the stats, we looked at the stats, we kind of made an idea of what items that we kind of want and kind of going into it really good. I think we can agree. I think I can kind of say like feel confident now if I go and do the comp, I know what items I kind of want on the comp and ideally what I want. I think the last thing to check is, what happens if I want to itemize Aatrox? We just look at quickly Aatrox, just Aatrox. What are good Aatrox items? And you can kind of see from here his items. You can say like, okay, well, they're all really high placements, but I think what's really important to know is Eyelayer's Infinity Edge. He really likes Infinity Edge. Normally Mbessa doesn't, and neither does Belveth, but he really likes it. It's a little bit low sample size, but like that's pretty good. Like, we can kind of see here, like even Deathblade is really good. Deathblade is really good. Giant Slayer is really good. Quicksilver is really good on him. Gunblade's decent on him. You can see here BT is pretty low placement, but you kind of need the BT or some form of at least getting to 40% Omnivamp to unlock him. So we can kind of go from there, like what items does he like, and that's just really good. So I think kind of going from there, we can kind of see like what Aatrox does like and doesn't like, and say it's pretty solid. So yeah, I would say like that's at least how we would look at stats. It's kind of, again, not like the most efficient or really pro way to do it. Kind of just starting off again, no disclaimer, I am just a Masters 300 LP player-ish, but hopefully throughout my journey I should be able to kind of share what I learn and document it with everyone and showcase, so there's an easier way for everyone to kind of get this information, but also to help those who just want to compete as well and they feel lost like I have before. And don't get me wrong, I'm still kind of lost, I'm still learning on new things, but I think it's really important. And then the other things they've said, like the next time hopefully it'd be watching VODs and like how to actually VOD review. That's actually one of my weaker points. And it means it's always studying, right? But like they kind of go hand in hand. It's really important to level up your gameplay because then you can notice these mistakes and then also learn to get better. And always helps to ask others when you don't know. So hopefully this helps. I will be trying to again record this a little bit more often in general and just hold myself accountable when I'm studying. I don't really know if I'm going to be posting it every day. I think trying to see like what's really important, that's really helpful in learning, that isn't necessarily too repetitive, but also anything new that I learn. I might just also just turn to like, hey, like instead of a little bit less informative, I'm kind of just talking to myself and kind of just, oh, hey, this is what I studied. So I'm open to feedback and notes and anything. I am also streaming on Twitch. This would be StephK_P for the time being on Twitch. Mainly I'm going to be streaming like my games and just like occasional VOD reviews of my own games, and that's also going to be where you can see when I try to active VOD review. It won't be as in depth as one of the videos I'll probably be doing later, but just keep that in mind. And yeah, hopefully it's really again helpful, and these are just the steps that I'm taking and what I'm learning and doing so I can compete at the top level like all the other pros. So hopefully this helps, and until next time, thanks for watching, guys. See ya.